Welcome back to our panel discussion, Moving to the Cloud with a Secure Cyber Foundation, sponsored by Fortinet, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests today are Philip Quade, the Chief Information Security Officer at Fortinet. Paul Morris is Chief Information Security Officer and Executive Director for the Information Assurance and Cybersecurity at the Transportation Security Administration. Colonel Brian Lytle is Program Executive Officer of the Cyber Development Directorate at the Defense Information Systems Agency. Bo Hauser is Chief Information Security Officer at the Small Business Administration. And Greg Hall is Assistant Director of Information Security and the Chief Information Security Officer in the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys at the Justice Department. I'm your host, Tom Temin. And before the break, we were talking about this whole idea of containers and what tools can go in the containers and are the tools for cyber backward compatible or down the wire back to your own premises. And Paul, I think you wanted to pick up on that also.
I think Bo was leading in the right direction, but the thing that I want to always talk to my team about is there's an opportunity to change how we've done things. There's a different strategy with containers where we don't have to really think about that container, which was this virtualized machine where I've got to worry about it being infected and is there something there, is that if I can just maybe look at the integrity of the container, if it starts to wobble, I throw it away and create a new one. I focus on that container and it's so easily disposable. The second thing is that it's much more secure from my perspective, where today in the environment I've got 3 copies. I've got one in development, I've got one in the test environment, I've got one in production, and depending on who's managing those environments, they may be different at any one time. So this really moves to the point where there's really one copy that I know has been completely patched, it's up to date, and when I throw that container out, I can bring in a new one to take over. So that strategy also changes the way that we approach it from that security monitoring and what do I need to. The last thing I would talk about when we do talk about containerization is that container services platform that we're now introducing is really the point of threat that we're starting to think about. Before VMs, how do you keep VMs from attacking each other? Well, now it's that container orchestration software underneath that may be the point of the threat. So we're looking at how do we monitor that as well. But Bo's right. It's about who's in there, or they should be there, and from an identity perspective, and what data is it do they have access to?
Yeah, I guess if someone had access to that orchestration layer, then they could cause you to rapidly reproduce a threat as opposed to killing it and starting over.
Right.
Okay, have you found that also, Greg?
A little bit. I think it's easy to have the discussion about tools and we start talking about this tool or that tool, and I think what we should be talking about is being tool agnostic in some respects, right, and focusing more on standardization, right, and open APIs and those kinds of things where it doesn't matter what tool you choose. It really, what matters is how it integrates, and is it easy to integrate and support or is it not? And are there open data standards that we can use to exchange data across multiple security platforms? Right, and I think these are things that we need to drive to the vendors, right, through our procurement actions and say, hey, we want you to support open standards, right? We want you to support data standards and be able to share information across multiple platforms. It's not necessarily the case that there's going to be a suite solution for every particular platform within an environment, right? There might be multiple point solutions and they all have to play nicely in the sandbox. So I think that's a really important concept, and I think that we need to think about that regardless of what environment it's in, whether it's the cloud environment within a VPC or a container or on-premise or whatever, right? That's important.
Yeah, the goal is to be able to sleep at night knowing your data is safe and not particularly worrying about what toolbox you're unfolding for that particular situation.
Exactly.
And that gets to the issue of complexity. And I know, Brian, that's something you have lived with ever since your artillery days, as you moved into IT.
Yeah, so my background is on the software engineering for the combat forces of the Army, and then growing up and coming into DISA to moving from that complex moving physical domain into the cyberspace domain where everything is logical. Really those standards that Greg was talking about become very, very important. Our logistics community, our maneuver community, the fires community, et cetera, on the land side of the house have all done a pretty good job over the last several decades on standardizing communications with each other. When you move up into the joint or the Defense Department level, I'm now protecting 3.5 million users, 6 million machines, terabytes upon terabytes of data coming in and out of the department every day through mostly DISA-controlled spaces, but some others as well. So how do you possibly standardize to find efficiencies and still maintain operations on a daily basis? Greg pointed out, I don't really want to get into tool wars. I completely agree. I'm pushing for open standards and communications across vendors to where I can be tool agnostic. As I run through my procurement cycle every 5 years, I potentially could have a new vendor come into this space with new or updated capabilities. It could be hosted within one of my data centers. It could be a machine that's owned and operated by a local command, or yet it might be hosted within a cloud environment. So I have to be able to account for all those different types of architectures and the depth and breadth of the mission spaces that the Defense Department has, ranging from support to civilian authorities up to and including physical wartime environments. So I really need a toolkit that will interoperate across a suite of systems that are owned by commanders in a variety of situations. And for me, that really pushes towards that set of open standards that allows everyone to interoperate together.
Yeah, and we've seen over the decades of computing, whenever something becomes big and it has lots of vendors, then often you see alliances and open interfaces and sharing take place. And I guess that's happening through the Cyber Threat Alliance, Phil, that's something that Fortinet's involved with.
Sure. Fortinet helped start the Cyber Threat Alliance with the idea that fundamentally that sharing information benefits everyone, specifically threat information. One of our slogans is that one man's detection is another man's prevention. So what we mean is that if those who are experts at doing threat research in the private sector were to share that information with each other, the whole community is better off. And so we're trying to turn the theory of information sharing into operational action in the private sector side. The next evolution of that, though, goes beyond simple sharing. We think it's what we call automatic ingestion, auto-ingestion of sets data, because you don't want to have a bunch of pitchers and not too many catchers. You want to make sure that you have to be able to catch that threat information and automatically act on it in cyber relevant time.
Yeah, that whole idea of sharing among federal agencies, you hear a lot of talk about. It's probably not that well developed as people wish, but the idea of interfaces and interoperability among vendors voluntarily, that's another whole level of this. Comments?
Being able to share all of those threats and the knowledge of what those are across my entire DoD enterprise is something that we're seeking, not just for situational awareness, but speed and efficiencies within all the programs in order for us to detect across that. Vendors have formed an alliance to share their research and development to understand what the threats are that they then take out and make it an appropriate response within their own individual product lines. I'm then able to take advantage of that within all the products that I have, because I'm always operating in a hybrid environment with many vendors within my architecture as well. So something that I see down at my endpoint would also be communicated back to that vendor-specific cloud application and then spread out throughout the rest of their architecture as well, informing the rest of their customers as well as to include the rest of the Defense Department that uses that particular product line as well.
So it's a good argument for keeping your apps up to date.
Absolutely. And those updates occur, in seconds or minutes now, instead of waiting days or sometimes weeks to actually get an individual signature that counters a specific threat in as well. So we're definitely speeding up our operations and the ability to defend ourselves in almost real time now.
Yeah, and Bo, as a relatively small agency compared to, say, the Defense Department or, the Justice Department or Homeland Security, you probably have this desire to get information on what's happening in terms of cyber threats elsewhere. What's your strategy for trying to make sure you not only get it, but are aware of what's coming in?
Right, and I think this is where the federal government is focused on shared services. We really want to maximize the resources, the cybersecurity resources across government as far as possible, especially when it comes to mid-sized and smaller agencies. So we don't have to recreate a full featured program because that's expensive. So what we do is take advantage of the DHS shared services. One of their shared services is the automated indicator sharing program, and that is for federal agencies and for private sector. But where I think that we need to strengthen the information sharing tools and capabilities is around the trust factor. If we're going to get to a point where we're going to go shields up against these indicators at wire speed, we have to have a trust level associated with that indicator, and that's where we're just not as mature as I would like to see, because we've seen before we block something that shouldn't be blocked, and it's because that trust factor is not really where it needs to be.
Yeah, so this idea, say in software development and deployment, there's a lot of orchestration and automation coming into that whole field, creating containers. But when it comes to reacting to threats, you're saying that without trustworthy data coming in, invoking automated procedures, you could do some damage. Or
Right,
shut down
there's-
things that don't need to be shut down.
Right. There's a lot of progress. There's been a lot of progress made in sharing information as quickly as folks are aware of it for situational awareness. But I think we need to focus some effort now around the trust level associated with the indicator and really mature that area so that agencies can leverage it at in an automated fashion.
Greg, comments?
Sure. I think there's other opportunities as well. I think there are opportunities for the government to actually help industry look at their particular vertical or their potential ecosystem partners in a whole new way. And examples of that would be within our Identity and Access Management program, where we've worked with particular vendors and where we thought there might be a good connector there that allows authentication information to be shared with Identity Governance Administration information. It really wasn't there. And so what ends up happening is a new formation of a business strategic alliance among these vendors that begins to bear real fruit for them, both within their vertical as well as across the federal government for folks that can reuse that service. We've also seen that same opportunity present itself with regards to privilege access management solutions and Identity Governance Administration solutions, and we've again been the catalyst for a connector being built there. So I think not only is sharing information important, but I think just technologically looking at how these solutions interoperate and how they communicate with one another, we've had an opportunity to really be a change agent in the commercial industry. And so it's exciting to think about new ways to work with partners within the cybersecurity environment. I think both within, again, systems integrations perspective as well as sharing cyber data and having real-time situational awareness.
Sure, and Phil, as this whole situation gets more pronounced, more urgent, what about that sharing among vendors and that you mentioned earlier?
We need to continue to find ways to embrace innovative products. So I'm going to quote an old Defense Department boss, Donald Rumsfeld. He talked about having a strategy that goes after the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. So information sharing takes on the known knowns directly. If you can find out a vulnerability or a threat and characterize it into an indicator, you can knock down those known threats, those known risks. The known unknowns are taken care of by behavior-based technology. What are the risky indicators that you or your peers are seeing that you can then incorporate and use to mitigate risky behaviors? And lastly, the unknown unknowns, the way you go about preparing for that is by future-proofing your architecture, by allow the easy integration of innovative products that aren't yet invented. And that gets back to one of the points made earlier about making sure you have an open architecture in which you can embrace those yet to be developed products.
Yeah, so that's right. And as we build these hybrid environments, everything has to, there's the modernization overlay that is coming from the White House, and really I think every agency has the need to modernize their some of their old applications and their infrastructure. So that gets to that idea of what kind of architecture do you replace it with, because really the architecture is the underlying, I guess, characteristic that'll let modernization happen not just now but in the future. So how do you approach that one given the hybrid environments that we have and the threat situation that we have? Paul?
Architecture is where we start every morning. Every contract that I'm involved in, working with every line of business, it starts with what's the proposed architecture? How is it going to integrate with our identity stores? How are we going to know where the data is at? It's those two fundamental pendings that we have to approach every piece of architecture. And then are they going to use common services that we have throughout TSA? We have over 70 systems, over 15 that are in development. A lot of those are in clouds, and it is a complex task, but the architecture can be put in place to enable those to succeed. It's up to us to then define what the rules of engagement are. Here's how you plug in. As an example, you show up and we're going to enable a software as a service platform. Well, here's how you're going to get your identity. We're going to kind of plug it in this way, and I expect the vendor to kind of play this way. Well, we have to make that known. We have to be able to publicize how we're going to do that in a common, repeatable process so we can have those expected outcomes. So It is complex, it's growing, and I think there's some opportunities to change it as we move into the platform as a service, get out of the infrastructure days. I think in the future we really need to talk more about software-defined networking and maybe shifting some of these responsibilities to a vendor who can maintain some of these more core IT. But that's longer term, because we are going to be dealing with legacy data centers and data and some of these things that are very expensive to replace, but vital to the nation's security for an awfully long time.
Sure. Greg?
I think some of this is not a technology issue. I also think that some of this is, a policy planning, governance issue, right? Paul and I were talking earlier about eyesight, right? And I think one of the things that was so wonderful about eyesight was it really commoditized IT, right? And it provided a reference architecture, and people knew how to plug in, and they knew how to consume those services.
Eyesight, we should clarify the sharing environment of the intelligence community.
Correct,
right?
Tom, yep. And so I think
Early in the social media era.
that's right. Standardized unified communications, applications and applications mall, cloud service providers, desktop services. I mean, you name it, it basically identified that as a commoditized IT service, and it actually adopted contemporary business models and named service providers, right, among the intelligence community. A pretty novel concept. But so I think, part of the architecture discussion is understanding the big picture, right? And I think, eyesight really had the fortuity of having a big picture leadership in place and supporting that. And, things that came out of that were data standards, right? And metadata standards, and basically enforcing those standards when data was ingested to do analytics. A referenced architecture came out of that. So, and that could be applicable both in the cloud and on-prem, right? I think it's important for folks to really understand the environment and know how they fit in that environment, how to consume those services, and if they're a service provider, to provide those in a way that's scalable and affordable and easy to use.
And Brian, for your complexity challenge, is architecture the way ahead on that?
Yes, the architecture challenges we have as the department, as you have all the services with their Title X authorities and responsibilities to equip their own forces, but yet somehow federate back up to the Defense Department and into the overall federal government architectures as well. So we've been effective in some ways in consolidating onto single purchase buys. We also gain efficiencies of cost that way. However, you lose some of the initiative and the ingenuity when you try and field a single product across the entire Department of Defense. So you lose out on those new products you can rapidly field and provide a new capability out to your deploying forces or even into your enterprise itself. So having that open system architecture and the acquisition agility even to go out and purchase some of these more fine-grained individual capabilities and then integrate back up into an overall department level and reporting back, here's my current status, I'm patched to this level, or I'm not patched to this level, I'm going to have to delay for a couple of weeks because there's an operation ongoing, become very critical to our operations.
All right, on that note, we'll take another short break. This discussion is Moving to the Cloud with a Secure Cyber Foundation, sponsored by Fortinet, here on federalnewsradio.com and Federal News Radio 1500 AM.